Chapter 16. Yanqui Doodles I can paint better than anybody. Jackson Pollock, in de Kooning's Dream. During his presidency, Harry Truman liked to get up early and make for the National Gallery. Arriving before the city had risen, he would nod silently to the guard, whose special duty it was to unlock the door for the president's pre-breakfast stroll through the gallery. Truman relished these visits and recorded them in his diary. In 1948, after gazing at assorted Holbeins and Rembrandts, he entered the following observation. It's a pleasure to look at perfection and then think of the lazy, nutty moderns. It is like comparing Christ with Lenin. Publicly, he arrived at similar judgments, claiming that the Dutch masters make our modern-day daubers and frustrated ham and egg men look just what they are. In his scorn for the moderns, Truman articulated a view held by many Americans that linked experimental and especially abstract art to degenerate or subversive impulses. Those European vanguardists, who had fled the fascist jackboot, were now startled to find themselves in an America where modernism was once again being kicked about. This was, of course, consistent with the cultural fundamentalism of figures like McCarthy, and part of the confusing process by which America, whilst advocating freedom of expression abroad, seemed to begrudge such freedoms at home. On the floor of Congress, a high-octane assault was led by a Republican from Missouri, George Dondero, who declared modernism to be quite simply part of a worldwide conspiracy to weaken American resolve. All modern art is communistic, he announced, before moving on to a deranged but poetic exegesis of its various manifestations. Cubism aims to destroy by design disorder. Futurism aims to destroy by the machine myth. Dadaism aims to destroy by ridicule. Expressionism aims to destroy by aping the primitive and insane. Abstractionism aims to destroy by the creation of brainstorms. Surrealism aims to destroy by the denial of reason. One Darrow's neurotic assessment was echoed by a coterie of public figures, whose shrill denunciations rang across the floor of Congress and in the conservative press. Their attacks culminated in such claims as ultramodern artists are unconsciously used as tools of the Kremlin, and the assertion that, in some cases, abstract paintings were actually secret maps pinpointing strategic United States fortifications to. Modern art is actually a means of espionage, one opponent charged. If you know how to read them, modern paintings will disclose the weak spots in U.S. fortifications and such crucial constructions as Boulder Dam. This was not a propitious time for modernists. Most vulnerable to the attacks of the Dondero caucus was a group of artists that emerged in the late 1940s as the abstract expressionists. In reality, they were not a group at all. It is disastrous to name ourselves, de Kooning once warned, but a disparate band of painters bound more by a taste for artistic adventure than by any formal aesthetic common denominator. But they were linked by a similar past. Most of them had worked for the Federal Arts Project under Roosevelt's New Deal, producing subsidized art for the government and getting involved in left-wing politics. Foremost amongst them was Jackson Pollock, who in the 1930s had been involved in the communist workshop of the Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros. Adolph Gottlieb, William Baziotes, and several other abstract expressionists had all been communist activists. The fact that theirs had been more an untheorized affiliation with the left than anything deeper was immaterial to Dondero and his allies, who, unable or unwilling to distinguish between the biography and the work, conflated the political record of the artist with his aesthetic expression and damned both. Where Dondero saw in abstract expressionism evidence of a communist conspiracy, America's cultural mandarins detected a contrary virtue. For them, it spoke to a specifically anti-communist ideology, the ideology of freedom, of free enterprise. Non-figurative and politically silent, it was the very antithesis to socialist realism. It was precisely the kind of art the Soviets loved to hate. But it was more than this. It was, claimed its apologists, an explicitly American intervention in the modernist canon. As early as 1946, critics were applauding the new art as independent, self-reliant, a true expression of the national will, spirit, and character. It seems that, in aesthetic character, U.S. art is no longer a repository of European influences, that it is not a mere amalgamate of foreign isms, assembled, compiled, and assimilated with lesser or greater intelligence. 4. Elevated as chief representative of this new national discovery was Jackson Pollock. He was the great American painter, said fellow artist Bud Hopkins. If you conceive of such a person, first of all, he had to be a real American, not a transplanted European. And he should have the big macho American virtues. He should be rough and tumble American, taciturn, ideally, and if he is a cowboy, so much the better. Certainly not an Easterner, not someone who went to Harvard. He shouldn't be influenced by the Europeans so much as he should be influenced by our own, the Mexicans and American Indians, and so on. He should come out of the native soil, not out of Picasso and Matisse. And he should be allowed the great American vice, the Hemingway vice, of being a drunk. 5. Everything about Pollock was right. Born on a sheep ranch in Cody, Wyoming, he entered the New York scene like a cowboy, hard-talking, heavy drinking, shooting his way from the Wild West. This was, of course, a mythical past. Pollock had never ridden a horse and had left Wyoming as a young child. But the image was so apt, so American, and no one disbelieved it. Willem de Kooning once told of a dream he'd had of Pollock, flinging open the doors of a bar like a screen cowboy and shouting, "I can paint better than anybody." He had the grittiness of Marlon Brando, the brooding rebelliousness of James Dean. Next to Matisse, by now barely able to lift a paintbrush, the compromised and impotent figurehead of an aging European modernism, Pollock was virility incarnate. He came up with a technique known as action painting, which involved laying a huge canvas flat on the ground, preferably outdoors, and dripping paint all over it. In the splurgy, random knot of lines which threaded their way across the canvas and over the edges, he seemed to be engaged in the act of rediscovering America. Ecstatic, loose, fueled by drink, modernism in Pollock's hands was a kind of tremendous delirium. Although one critic described it as melted Picasso, others rushed to celebrate it as the triumph of American painting, which spoke for what America was: vigorous, energetic, freewheeling, big. It was seen to uphold the great American myth of the lone voice, the intrepid individual, a tradition which Hollywood enshrined in films such as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and later, 12 Angry Men. The abstract expressionists once styled themselves the irascibles. By 1948, the art critic Clement Greenberg, himself a brawling, boozing, one-man slugfest, was making prodigal claims for the new aesthetic. When one sees how much the level of American art has risen in the last 5 years with the emergence of new talents so full of energy and content as Arshila Gorky, Jackson Pollock, David Smith, then the conclusion forces itself, much to our own surprise, that the main premises of Western art have at last migrated to the United States, along with the center of gravity of industrial production and political power. 6. America, in other words, was the place an artist no longer felt he had to escape from in order to mature in Europe. 7. Commenting on this claim, rather than agreeing with it, Jason Epstein later said, "America, and especially New York, had now become the center of the world politically and financially, and of course it had become the center culturally too. Well, what would a great power be without an appropriate art? You couldn't be a great power if you didn't have art to go with it, like Venice without Tintoretto, or Florence without Giotto." 8. The idea that abstract expressionism could become a vehicle for the imperial burden began to take hold. But its emergence at a time of such political and moral odium presented its would-be promoters with a substantial dilemma. Despite the patent idiocy of Dondero's protests, by the late 1940s, he had achieved the collapse of successive attempts on the part of the State Department to deploy American art as a propaganda weapon. The Philistines scored an early victory in 1947 when they forced the withdrawal of a State Department exhibition called Advancing American Art, a selection of 79 progressive works, including those of Georgia O'Keeffe, Adolph Gottlieb, and Arshel Gorky, which was scheduled to travel to Europe and Latin America. The show reached Paris, then moved on to Prague, where it was such a success that the Russians immediately sent in a rival exhibition. The official rationale for this venture was to dispel for the foreign audience any notion of the academic or imitative character of contemporary American art. This time, we are exporting neither domestic brandy in imitation cognac bottles nor vintage non-intoxicating grape juice, but real bourbon, aged in the wood, what may justly be described as the wine of the country, 10 eulogized one critic. Far from advancing the cause of American art, the show signaled its ignominious retreat. Vigorously contested in Congress, it was denounced as subversive and un-American. One speaker detected a malicious intent to tell the foreigners that the American people are despondent, broken down, or of hideous shape, thoroughly dissatisfied with their lot and eager for a change of government. The communists and their New Deal fellow travelers have selected art as one of their avenues of propaganda. 11. I am just a dumb American who pays taxes for this kind of trash, cried another, a worthy progenitor of Jesse Helms. If there is a single individual in this Congress who believes this kind of tripe is bringing a better understanding of American life, then he should be sent to the same nut house from which the people who drew this stuff originally came. 12. The show was canceled, and the paintings were sold off at a 95% discount as surplus government property. Responding to the charge that many of the artists represented in the exhibition had dabbled in left-wing politics, then a sine qua non of any self-respecting vanguardist, the State Department issued a craven directive ordering that in future, no American artist with communist or fellow traveling associations be exhibited at government expense. And with this, the perception of avant-garde art as un-American had now been incorporated into official policy. 13. A terrible vision of the barbarians at the gates of the Palace of High Art now insinuated its way into the imagination of the cultural elitists. Dwight MacDonald denounced these attacks as Kultur Bolshevismus and argued that while they were proposed in the name of American democracy, they actually mirrored totalitarian attacks on the arts. The Soviets, and indeed much of Europe, were saying that America was a cultural desert, and the behavior of U.S. congressmen seemed to confirm that. Eager to show the world that here was an art commensurate with America's greatness and freedom, high-level strategists found they couldn't publicly support it because of domestic opposition. So what did they do? They turned to the CIA, and a struggle began to assert the merits of abstract expressionism against attempts to smear it. We had a lot of trouble with Congressman Dondero, Braden later recalled. He couldn't stand modern art. He thought it was a travesty. He thought it was sinful. He thought it was ugly. He put up a heck of a fight about painting, and he made it very difficult to get Congress to go along with some of the things that we wanted to do. Send art abroad, send symphonies abroad, publish magazines abroad, whatever. That's one of the reasons why it had to be done covertly. It had to be covert because it would have been turned down if it had been put to a vote in a democracy. In order to encourage openness, we had to be secret. 14, here again was that sublime paradox of American strategy in the cultural Cold War. In order to promote an acceptance of art produced in and vaunted as the expression of democracy, the democratic process itself had to be circumvented. Once again, the CIA turned to the private sector to advance its objectives. In America, most museums and collections of art were, as they are now, privately owned and privately funded. Preeminent amongst contemporary and avant-garde art museums was the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York. Its president through most of the 1940s and 1950s was Nelson Rockefeller, whose mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, had co-founded the museum in 1929. Nelson called it Mommy's Museum. Nelson was a keen supporter of abstract expressionism, which he referred to as free enterprise painting. Over the years, his private collection alone swelled to over 2,500 works. Thousands more covered the lobbies and walls of buildings belonging to the Rockefeller-owned Chase Manhattan Bank. Supporting left-wing artists was familiar territory for the Rockefellers. When challenged over her decision to promote the Mexican revolutionary Diego Rivera, who had once chanted "Death to the Gringos" outside an American embassy, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller had argued that Reds would stop being Reds if we could get them artistic recognition. A one-man show for Rivera, the second in MoMA's history, duly followed. In 1933, Nelson Rockefeller had supervised Rivera's commission to paint a mural at the newly erected Rockefeller Center. Inspecting Rivera's work one day, Nelson noticed that one figure had taken on the unmistakable features of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He politely asked Rivera to remove it. Rivera politely refused. At Nelson's instruction, the mural was surrounded by guards whilst Rivera was handed a check for his full fee, $21,000, and served notice that his commission was canceled. In February 1934, the mural, which had been nearly completed, was destroyed with jackhammers. Although this particular piece of patronage was unsuccessful, the principle which guided it was not abandoned. Establishment figures continued to believe that leftist artists were worth supporting. In the process, it could be hoped that the political clamor of the artist might be drowned out by the clink of the patron's coin. In a famous article entitled Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Clement Greenberg, the art critic who did most to put abstract expressionism on the map, set out the ideological rationale for accepting sponsorship from an enlightened patron. Published in Partisan Review in 1939, the article still stands as the definitive article of faith for the elitist and anti-Marxist view of modernism. The avant-garde, wrote Greenberg, had been abandoned by those to whom it actually belongs, our ruling class. In Europe, traditionally, support was provided by an elite among the ruling classes, from which the avant-garde assumed itself to be cut off, but to which it had always remained attached by an umbilical cord of gold. 15. In the United States, he argued, the same mechanism must prevail. The really deep connection between abstract expressionism and the cultural Cold War can be found here. It was according to this principle that the CIA, together with its private venture capitalists, operated. Tom Braden, in particular, was attracted to the Greenbergian proposition that progressive artists need an elite to subsidize them, just like their Renaissance forebears. I've forgotten which pope it was who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, he said, but I suppose that if it had been submitted to a vote of the Italian people, there would have been many, many negative responses. It's naked, or it isn't the way I imagine God, or whatever. I don't think it would have gotten through the Italian parliament if there had been a parliament at the time. It takes a pope or somebody with a lot of money to recognize art and to support it. And after many centuries, people say, look, the Sistine Chapel, the most beautiful creation on earth. It's a problem that civilization has faced ever since the first artist and the first multimillionaire, or pope, who supported him. And yet, if it hadn't been for the multimillionaires or the popes, we wouldn't have had the art. 16 patronage, in Braden's terms, carried with it a duty to instruct, to educate people to accept not what they want or think they want, but what they ought to have. You have always to battle your own ignoramuses, or to put it more politely, people who just don't understand. There is a perverse way of looking at this question, which is to say the CIA took art very seriously, commented art critic Philip Dodd. The great thing about politicians when they get involved in art is it means something to them, whether it's the fascists or the Soviets or the American CIA. So there may be a really perverse argument that says the CIA were the best art critics in America in the 50s because they saw work that actually should have been antipathetic to them, made by old lefties coming out of European surrealism, and they saw the potential power in that kind of art and ran with it. You couldn't say that of many of the art critics of the time. 18. Regarding abstract expressionism, I'd love to be able to say that the CIA invented it all, just to see what happened in New York and downtown Soho tomorrow. 19. Joked agency man Donald Jameson before moving to a more sober explanation of the CIA's involvement. We recognize that this was the kind of art that did not have anything to do with socialist realism, and made socialist realism look even more stylized and more rigid and confined than it was. And that relationship was exploited in some of the exhibits. Moscow in those days was very vicious in its denunciation of any kind of nonconformity to its own very rigid patterns. So one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth support one way or another. Of course, for matters of this sort, it could only have been done through the organizations or the operations of the CIA at 2 or 3 removed, so that there wouldn't be any question of having to clear Jackson Pollock, for example, or do anything that would involve these people in the organization. They'd just be added at the end of the line. I don't think that there was any significant relationship between us and Robert Motherwell, for example. And it couldn't have been any closer, and certainly shouldn't have been any closer either, because most of them were people who had very little respect for the government in particular, and certainly none for the CIA. If you had to use people who considered themselves one way or another, closer to Moscow than to Washington, well, so much the better, perhaps. 20 operating at a remove from the CIA and therefore offering a plausible disguise for its interests was the Museum of Modern Art. An inspection of MoMA's committees and councils reveals a proliferation of links to the agency. First and foremost was Nelson Rockefeller himself, who had headed up the government's Wartime Intelligence Agency for Latin America, named the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, CIAA. This agency, among other activities, sponsored touring exhibitions of contemporary American painting. 19 of these shows were contracted to MoMA. As a trustee of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a New York think tank subcontracted by the government to study foreign affairs, Rockefeller presided over some of the most influential minds of the period as they thrashed out definitions of American foreign policy. In the early 1950s, he received briefings on covert activities from Allen Dulles and Tom Braden, who later said, "I assumed Nelson knew pretty much everything about what we were doing." A reasonable assumption, given Nelson's appointment as Eisenhower's special advisor on Cold War strategy in 1954, replacing C.D. Jackson, and his chairmanship of the Planning Coordination Group, which oversaw all National Security Council decisions, including CIA covert operations. Rockefeller's close friend was John "Jock" Hay Whitney, a longtime trustee of MoMA, who also served as its president and chairman of the board. Educated at Groton, Yale, and Oxford, Jock had converted a substantial inheritance into a vast fortune by bankrolling fledgling companies, Broadway plays, and Hollywood movies. As director of Rockefeller's motion picture division at CIA in 1942, Jock oversaw production of such films as Disney's Salud Us Amigos, which brimmed with inter-American goodwill. He joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in 1943, was captured in southern France by German soldiers in August 1944, and loaded onto a train heading east before making a daring escape. After the war, he set up J.H. Whitney & Co. as a partnership dedicated to the propagation of the free enterprise system by the furnishing of financial backing for new, undeveloped, and risky businesses that might have trouble attracting investment capital through more conservative channels. 21, a prominent partner was William H. Jackson, a polo-playing friend of Jock's, who also happened to be deputy director of the CIA. Jock had a position on the Psychological Strategy Board and found many ways of being useful to the CIA. 22, another link was William Burden, who first joined the museum as chairman of its advisory committee in 1940. Descended from Commodore Vanderbilt, Burden epitomized the Cold War establishment. Formerly Secretary of State for Air, he too had worked for Rockefeller's CIAA during the war. He had also earned a personal fortune and a reputation as a venture capitalist of the first rank. Chairing numerous quasi-governmental bodies, and even the CIA's Farfield Foundation, of which he was president, he seemed happy to perform as a frontman. In 1947, he was appointed chairman of the Committee on Museum Collections, and in 1956 he became MoMA's president. Under Burden's presidency, policy was made by René Darnoncourt so far as the operations of the museum were concerned, with consultations conducted pretty much on a rubber stamp basis. 23. This gave Darnoncourt scope to exercise his considerable talents as the Cardinal Wolsey of the court circles surrounding MoMA. Standing at 6 feet 5 inches and weighing 230 pounds, the Viennese-born Darnoncourt was an extraordinary figure, a descendant, direct and collateral, of a cloud of Middle European noblemen who flourished as chamberlains and provosts, to a cloud of dukes of Lorraine, counts of Luxembourg, and Habsburg emperors. 24. He emigrated to the States in 1932, and during the war worked in the art section of the CIAA. Nelson then recruited him to the museum, of which he became director in 1949. Darnoncourt believed that modern art in its infinite variety and ceaseless exploration was the foremost symbol of democracy and openly lobbied Congress during the 1950s to finance a cultural campaign against communism. Although Braden maintained that the guys at MoMA liked to handle things in-house, he concluded that René de Harnoncourt was most likely the agency's contact at the museum. Certainly, de Harnoncourt was consulting with the National Security Council's Operations Coordinating Board, which had replaced the Psychological Strategy Board. He also reported regularly to the State Department. These liaisons give a certain piquancy to the comment that, like his ancestors, de Harnoncourt exhibited a gift for making himself indispensable to a succession and quite often an overlapping of patrons. 25. William Paley, heir to the Congress Cigar Company, was yet another MoMA trustee with close links to the intelligence world. A personal friend of Allen Dulles, Paley allowed CBS, the network he owned, to provide cover for CIA employees, in an arrangement similar to that authorized by Henry Luce at his Time Life empire. Luce was also a MoMA trustee. At the height of this relationship, CBS correspondents joined the CIA hierarchy once a year for private dinners and briefings. These dinners, grown-up affairs with good table talk and good cigars, were held at Dulles's home or at his private club, The Alibi, in Washington. Of Paley's involvement with the CIA, one CBS executive said, "It's the single subject about which his memory has failed." 26 on and on go the names, on and on go the links. Joseph Verner Reed, for example, was a MoMA trustee at the same time as he was a trustee of the Farfield Foundation. So was Gardner Cowles. So was Yanqui Fleischman. So was Cass Canfield. Ovida Kulphabi, a founding member of MoMA, sat on the board of the Free Europe Committee and allowed her family foundation to be used as a CIA conduit. While she was Secretary of State for Health, Education, and Welfare under Eisenhower, her assistant was one Joan Braden, who had previously worked for Nelson Rockefeller. Joan was married to Tom. Tom, before he joined the CIA, had also worked for Nelson Rockefeller as the Museum of Modern Art's executive secretary from 1947 to late 1949. As Gore Vidal once said, "Everything has so many chains of association in our unexpectedly Jacobean republic that nothing any longer surprises." Of course, it could be argued that this congruity revealed nothing more than the nature of American power at the time. Just because these people knew each other, and just because they were socially and even formally enjoined to the CIA, doesn't mean that they were co-conspirators in the promotion of the new American art. But the cosinus of the relationship ensured the durability of claims that MoMA was in some official way connected to the government's secret cultural warfare program. This rumor was first examined in 1974 by Eva Cockcroft in a seminal article for Artforum called Abstract Expressionism, Weapon of the Cold War, which concluded, links between cultural Cold War politics and the success of abstract expressionism are by no means coincidental. They were consciously forged at the time by some of the most influential figures controlling museum policies and advocating enlightened Cold War tactics designed to woo European intellectuals. 27. Moreover, Cockcroft asserted, in terms of cultural propaganda, the functions of both the CIA's cultural apparatus and MoMA's international programs were similar and, in fact, mutually supportive. 28. I didn't have anything to do with promoting Pollock or whomever, said Lawrence de Neufville. I don't even remember when I first heard of him, but I do remember hearing that Jock Whitney and Allen Dulles agreed they had to do something about modern art after the State Department caved in. Perhaps that's how you might define mutually supportive. 29. There is no prima facie evidence for any formal agreement between the CIA and the Museum of Modern Art. The fact is, it simply wasn't necessary. MoMA's defenders have consistently attacked the claim that the museum's support of abstract expressionism was in any way linked to the covert advancement of America's international image. Curiously, one argument they use is that MoMA actually neglected the movement when it first emerged. The Modern's exhibitions of abstract expressionism, more so at home, but also abroad, came on the whole only during the later 50s, by which time the movement's first generation had already been followed by a second. 30 wrote Michael Kimmelman in a rebuttal commissioned by MoMA. To argue that MoMA simply missed what was right under its nose is disingenuous. and ignores the fact that the museum had steadily and consistently collected works by the abstract expressionists from the time of their earliest appearance. From 1941, MoMA acquired works by Arshila Gorky, Alexander Calder, Frank Stella, Robert Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, Stuart Davis, and Adolph Gottlieb. In May 1944, the museum sold at auction certain of its 19th century works of art to provide funds for the purchase of 20th century works. Although receipts from the sale were disappointing, enough cash was made available to purchase important paintings by Pollock, Motherwell, and Matta. Thus, as might be expected of a museum of modern art, and particularly one which acknowledged that it held a tremendous moral responsibility toward living artists whose careers and fortunes can be drastically affected by the museum's support or lack of it, 31 was the new generation of American painters brought into its fold. That these acquisitions were made in the face of internal opposition further demonstrates a resolve to consolidate abstract expressionism's right to canonical recognition. When some members of the Committee of Museum Collections, encouraged by adverse newspaper criticism, vigorously questioned the validity of certain acquisitions, including paintings called Abstract Expressionist, 32, their protests were ineffectual, and nobody stood in the way when one committee member resigned in protest against the purchase of a Rothko. As for foreign tours, Motherwell, Mark Tobey, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Gottlieb were all selected for the exhibition American Painting from the 18th Century to the Present Day, which opened in London in 1946, before proceeding to other European capitals. This was one of the earliest appearances of abstract expressionism in a group show under official auspices. Sponsorship was provided by the State Department and the Office of War Information. The same year, the MoMA show 14 Americans included Gorky, Motherwell, Tobey, and Theodore Rossack. By 1948, Lincoln Kirstein, a former MoMA activist, was moaning in Harper's that the museum has done its job almost too well by making itself into a modern abstract academy, whose tenets he defined as improvisation as method, deformation as formula, and painting as an amusement manipulated by interior decorators and high-pressure salesmen. 33 in 1952, some 50 American artists, including Edward Hopper, Charles Birchfield, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and Jack Levine, attacked MoMA in what came to be known as the Reality Manifesto for coming to be more and more identified in the public eye with abstract and non-objective art, a dogma which they felt stemmed very largely from the modern museum and its unquestioned influence throughout the country. In the same year, the communist monthly masses and mainstream lampooned abstract art and its shrine, the Museum of Modern Art, in a tirade whose title, Dollars, Doodles, and Death, was eerily prophetic. Is it really possible to argue that MoMA came on board late? When Sidney Janis took the group show American Vanguard Art for Paris to the Galerie de France in late 1951, it was a resounding failure. Reviews were lukewarm at best and mostly downright hostile. Not one picture was sold. It was too early, Janis concluded. Other private gallery owners who championed the New York school were in no doubt that it was indebted to MoMA's early recognition. I must say that the Modern Museum was one of the first to accept people like Motherwell, Gottlieb, Baziotes, said Samuel Coots of the Coots Gallery. Alfred Barr was an enthusiast for those particular three men and conveyed this enthusiasm to people like Burden or Nelson Rockefeller and others of the modern group of trustees. As the authoritative tastemaker of his day, Alfred Barr's advocacy of abstract expressionism was integral to its success. Born in 1902 in Detroit, Barr entered Princeton in 1918 and emerged with a burning interest in art, military history, and chess, reflecting his concern with strategy and tactics. In 1929, at Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's invitation, he became MoMA's first director, a post he held until 1943, when he was replaced by René de Harnoncourt. Barr continued to keep an office in the museum, and in February 1947 was appointed director of museum collections. In a New Yorker profile, Dwight MacDonald described him as shy, frail, low of voice, and scholarly of mien, the austerity of his beak-nosed, bespectacled face relieved only by the kind of secret smile one sees on archaic Greek statues or on the carefully locked features of a psychoanalyst. But MacDonald noticed that there was more to Barr than simply another nice old absent-minded professor. In his quiet, rectitudinous way, he is more than something of a politician. The fine Italian hand of Alfred Barr has had its part in creating an atmosphere of intrigue in the museum, where things are not necessarily what they seem to such an extent that one bewildered artist has called the place the House of Mystery, if not mirth. MacDonald went on to quote Peggy Guggenheim, who once said of Barr that she hated his cagey quality, and another contemporary who detected something of the Jesuit about Alfred. But as the Jesuits practiced their wiles ad majorem Dei gloriam, so Barr maneuvers away for the greater glory of modern art and the museum. 35. Behind MoMA's strategies in this highly politicized period, there is evidence of Barr's Italian hand. As part of a deliberate maneuver to quieten opposition to the museum's cultivation of abstract expressionism, he followed a two-pronged policy that, for reasons of tact or diplomacy, was never acknowledged, but was manifested, especially in the museum's exhibition program. 36. Thus, there was no shortage of exhibitions catering to the prevailing taste for romantic or representational painting, leading one critic to charge that the museum was dedicated less to the art of our time than to the art of our grandfather's time. 37. But simultaneously, Barr was acquiring works by the New York School and canvassing discreetly for broader institutional support. It was he who persuaded Henry Luce of Time Life to change his editorial policy toward the new art, telling him in a letter that it should be especially protected, not criticized as in the Soviet Union, because this, after all, was artistic free enterprise. 38 thus was Luce, who held the phrase America's intellectual health permanently on the end of his tongue, won over to Barr's and MoMA's interests. In August 1949, Life magazine gave its center page spread to Jackson Pollock, landing the artist and his work on every coffee table in America. Such coverage, and Barr's effort to secure it, destroys the case for neglect. But it was loans to Europe from MoMA's collection which best illustrate the fortunes of the New York School. Under the auspices of the International Program, which was established in 1952 through a 5-year annual grant of $125,000 from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the museum launched a massive export program of abstract expressionism, which Barr himself referred to as a form of benevolent propaganda for foreign intelligentsia. 39. Another MoMA activist called it an immense asset toward foreign understanding. Director of the program was Porter McCrae, Yale graduate, and yet another veteran of Nelson Rockefeller's South American intelligence outfit. In December 1950, McCrae took a year's leave of absence from his job as director of MoMA's Department of Circulating Exhibitions to become an attaché in the U.S. Foreign Service, assigned to the cultural section of the Marshall Plan in Paris. Of this move, Russell Lynes wrote in his History of MoMA that the museum now had and was delighted to have the whole world, or at least the world outside the Iron Curtain, in which to proselytize, though this time the exportable religion was homegrown rather than what had been in the past its primary message, the importable faith from Europe. 40 in France, McCrae saw at first hand the negative impact of the State Department's official prescription of so-called left-wing artists, leaving what one American embassy official called a gap in American interests and activities, which not only is impossible for Europeans to understand, but which plays into the hands of the communists by appearing to justify their charge that America fails to share the basic values of Western civilization. 41. McCrae returned to MoMA with a mission to correct this impression. Under him, the museum's loans for touring exhibitions increased dramatically, even to a somewhat disquieting degree, according to one internal report, leaving the museum deprived of most of its best American paintings for 18 months in 1955. By 1956, the international program had organized 33 international exhibitions, including the U.S. participation in the Venice Biennale, the only country to be privately represented. At the same time, loans to U.S. embassies and consulates increased dramatically. There was a series of articles relating the Museum of Modern Art's international program to cultural propaganda, and even suggestions that it was associated with the CIA, and since I worked there through those years, I can say categorically untrue. 42, said Waldo Rasmussen, assistant to McCrae. The main emphasis of the international program was about art. It wasn't about politics, and it wasn't about propaganda. And in fact, it was important for an American museum to avoid the suggestion of cultural propaganda. And for that reason, it wasn't always advantageous to have connections with American embassies or American government figures, because that would suggest that the exhibitions were intended as propaganda, and they were not. 43. The Museum of Modern Art was neither free from propaganda nor from government figures. When, for example, it accepted the contract to supply the art exhibit for the Congress for Cultural Freedom's 1952 Masterpieces Festival in Paris, it did so under the auspices of trustees who were fully cognizant of the CIA's role in that organization. Moreover, the exhibit's curator, James Johnson Sweeney, a member of MoMA's advisory committee and of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, publicly endorsed the propaganda value of the show when he announced, "On display will be masterpieces that could not have been created, nor whose exhibition would be allowed by such totalitarian regimes as Nazi Germany or present-day Soviet Russia and her satellites." 44. The view that abstract art was synonymous with democracy, that it was on our side, was also stressed by Alfred Barr, who borrowed from Cold War rhetoric when he maintained that the modern artist's nonconformity and love of freedom cannot be tolerated within a monolithic tyranny, and modern art is useless for the dictator's propaganda. 45. Of far greater significance than Nabokov's Masterpieces exhibition was the 1953-4 tour of the show, 12 Contemporary American Painters and Sculptors. 46, the first by MoMA dedicated exclusively to the New York School. Opening at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, it was the first significant exhibition of American art to be held in a French museum for over 15 years. To preempt the accusation that it was spearheading a cultural invasion of France, whose own cultural chauvinism could not be underestimated, MoMA claimed that the show was the result of requests initiated by the host museum. In fact, the opposite was the case. According to a dispatch from the American Embassy in Paris, in early February 1953, the Museum of Modern Art requested the Cultural Relations section of the embassy to discuss with Jean Cassou, director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne at Paris, the possibility of putting on the present show. M. Cassou had already scheduled all of his exhibition space until the spring of 1954. On learning, however, that this exhibition would be available, he reorganized his plans and put off an exhibition of the Belgian painter Ensor, which had been planned. The dispatch complained of the embassy's inability to take any action on this request because of the absence of any art program under the auspices of the United States government, but went on to state that, in the case of the exhibition of American art under consideration, however, this deadlock was broken by action of the Nelson Rockefeller Fund, which allotted funds to the Museum of Modern Art in New York to be used for international exhibitions. 48. Unable to assume any official role in the exhibition, the American Embassy confined itself to acting as a quiet liaison between MoMA and its French hosts. These included the Association Française d'Action Artistique, which was attached to both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of National Education. The association came forward with a significant donation for a deluxe catalog, posters, and all publicity for the show. The link is interesting. The association was also a donor to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and its director, Philippe Erlanger, was, according to Yanqui Fleischman, one of those people in France who has been most helpful and cooperative every time that we have approached him with any problems having to do with the Congress. 49. Erlanger was, in fact, a designated CIA contact at the French Foreign Office. Through him, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and on this occasion MoMA, acquired a credible conduit for official French funds to cultural propaganda initiatives. René de Harnoncourt, who attached sufficient importance to the show to install it in person, could not have been ignorant of this connection. Elements of the French press picked up on the political maneuvering behind the show, and snide reference was made to the Musée d'Art Moderne as a new outpost of United States territory, and to the painters on show there as Mr. Foster Dulles. 12 apostles. as 12 contemporary American painters and sculptors was being packed up for its next destination. It traveled on to Zurich, Dusseldorf, Stockholm, Oslo, and Helsinki. MoMA was already preparing for its participation in an exhibition which would bring it once again into a direct relationship with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Writing to Nabokov on the 9th of April 1954, Monroe Wheeler, MoMA's Director of Exhibitions and Publications, confirmed that our coordination committee has agreed that we should cooperate as much as we can with your project for an exhibition of paintings by artists between the ages of 18 and 35. We would like to suggest for membership on your International Advisory Committee the museum's Director of Painting and Sculpture, Mr. Andrew Carnduff Ritchie. 50. The result of this collaboration was the Young Painters Show, which opened at the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Moderna in Rome, then moved to the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts, ICA, in London. Of the 170 paintings in the exhibit, nearly all were abstract works. Ritchie, who believed that artists working in the abstract mode were in some way responding to the weakness, even sterility of most non-communist figurative painting, selected works by Richard Diebenkorn, Seymour Drumlovich, Joseph Glasgow, Joseph Holtberg, Irving Kreisberg, and Theodoros Stamos. Thus, whilst European audiences were still being introduced to the first wave of abstract expressionists, Ritchie was already delivering the second. As usual, the Congress for Cultural Freedom rustled up large cash prizes to be awarded to the 3 best paintings. Holtberg shared the first prize for Best Painting with Giovanni Dova and Alan Reynolds, each receiving 1,000 Swiss francs, or $2,000, donated by Fleischmann. Funds to organize the show and for its transportation and publicity during the year that it toured were provided directly by the Farfield Foundation. MoMA's international program picked up the tab for transporting the works to and from Europe, using money supplied by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The Congress's media network did its part in amplifying the show's influence. Proeves devoted half of its October 1956 issue to the exhibition and published an international survey of young painters on the subject of abstraction versus figurative art. 51. Josselson, who averred that the problems of modern painting happen to be a hobby of mine, forwarded the survey to Nelson Rockefeller and said that it ranked high among the topics of discussion in Paris today. 52. The collaboration with the Congress brought MoMA access to the most prestigious art institutions in Europe. Sitting on the Congress Arts Committee were the directors of the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, Switzerland's Museum of Modern Art, London's ICA, the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin, the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, the Guggenheim Museum, New York and Venice, and the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Moderna in Rome. Combined with the economic strength of MoMA and, behind the scenes, the Farfield Foundation, this committee had the breadth and scope to influence aesthetic tastes across Europe. As one reviewer of Young Painters wrote, the fact that the exhibition conforms to the prevailing taste for various currents of abstract art and offers no surprises is probably attributable to the composition of the selection jury. Almost all members of the jury are museum directors, and as such, cannot be expected to outpace the established best. 53. There can be little doubt that this prevailing orthodoxy was carved out according to a political and not a solely aesthetic agenda. It was an agenda personally sanctioned by President Eisenhower, who, unlike Truman before him, recognized the value of modern art as a pillar of liberty. In an address which explicitly endorsed the work of MoMA, Eisenhower declared, "As long as artists are at liberty to feel with high personal intensity, as long as our artists are free to create with sincerity and conviction, there will be healthy controversy and progress in art. How different it is in tyranny, when artists are made the slaves and the tools of the state. When artists become chief propagandists of a cause, progress is arrested and creation and genius are destroyed." 54. These sentiments were echoed by a former chairman of MoMA's international program, August Heckscher, who claimed the museum's work was related to the central struggle of the age, the struggle of freedom against tyranny. We know that where tyranny takes over, whether under fascism or communism, modern art is destroyed and exiled. 55, George Kennan rallied to this free art ideology, telling an audience of MoMA activists in 1955 that they had a duty to correct a number of impressions that the outside world entertains of us. Impressions that are beginning to affect our international position in very important ways. 56. These negative feelings, said Kennan, were related to cultural rather than political conditions. His next point startled everyone. The totalitarians recognized that only if they appeared outwardly to enjoy the confidence and enthusiasm of the artists could they plausibly claim to have created a hopeful and creditable civilization. And I find it sad that they should have come to this appreciation so much sooner than many of our own people. 57. What, asked Kennan, was the nature of the task ahead? We have to show the outside world both that we have a cultural life and that we care something about it. That we care enough about it, in fact, to give it encouragement and support here at home, and to see that it is enriched by acquaintance with similar activity elsewhere. If these impressions could only be conveyed with enough force and success to countries beyond our borders, I, for one, would willingly trade the entire remaining inventory of political propaganda for the results that could be achieved by such results alone. 58. The Congress for Cultural Freedom's support for experimental, predominantly abstract painting over representational or realist aesthetics must be viewed in this context. From the statements of Tom Braden and Donald Jameson, it is evident that the CIA felt it had a part to play in encouraging consent for the new art. From the records of the Farfield Foundation, it can also be shown that the agency expressed its commitment with dollars. In addition to supporting the Young Painters Show, several donations were passed from the Farfield to MoMA, including $2,000 to its International Council in 1959 for the provision of books on modern art to Polish readers. There is further, incontrovertible evidence that the CIA was an active component in the machinery which promoted abstract expressionism. Immediately after the 1955-6 Young Painters Show closed, Nicholas Nabokov had started to plan a follow-up. Despite a faltering start, the proposal was finally approved in early 1959. Yanqui Fleischman, by now chairman of the Congress Music and Arts Committee, as well as a member of MoMA's International Arts Council, an expanded version of the international program, provided the link between the two organizations. Once again, MoMA selected the American participation for the show, mostly from works which had already been shipped to Europe for the Biennale de Paris. By the end of the year, Nabokov's secretary was able to tell Yanqui that news of the planned exhibition had swept through the artistic circles like a tornado. Every young painter in Paris, every gallery director, every art critic are telephoning the Congress to find out what it's all about. It's going to be a terrific hit. 59. Originally entitled Sources Poétiques de la Peinture Actuelle, the show, which finally opened in January 1960 at the Louvre's Musée des Arts Décoratifs, was called, more provocatively, Antagonism. Dominating the exhibition were works by Mark Rothko, who was in France at the time, Sam Francis, Yves Klein, in his first showing in Paris, Franz Klein, Louise Nevelson, Jackson Pollock, Mark Tobey, and Joan Mitchell. Many of the paintings had been brought to Paris from Vienna, where the Congress had exhibited them as part of a wider CIA-orchestrated campaign to undermine the 1959 Communist Youth Festival. This show had cost the CIA $15,365, but for its expanded version in Paris, they had to dig deeper. A further $10,000 was laundered through the Hoblitzell Foundation, to which was added $10,000 from the Association Française d'Action Artistique. Although the press paid lavish attention to the Antagonism show, the Congress was obliged to acknowledge that reviews were, on the whole, very spiteful. Although some European critics had been won over to the magnificent resonances and the breathless, dizzy world of abstract expressionism, many others were baffled or outraged by it. In Barcelona, a critic reviewing The New American Painting, which MoMA toured that year, was appalled to learn that two canvases, one by Jackson Pollock, the other by Grace Hartigan, were so big that the upper part of the metal entrance door of the museum had to be sawn off to get them in. The biggest in the world, announced Le Libre Belgique, which worried that this strength, displayed in the frenzy of a total freedom, seems a really dangerous tide. Our own abstract painters, all the informal European artists, seem pygmies before the disturbing power of these unchained giants. 60 references to the size, the violence, the Wild West abounded, as if the critics had got hold of the wrong catalog and thought the pictures were painted by Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid. 61. It was not only European artists who felt dwarfed by the gigantism of abstract expressionism. Adam Gopnik later concluded that oversized abstract watercolors had become the single style of the American Museum, forcing 2 generations of realists to live in basements and pass still lifes around like samizdat. 62, John Canaday reflected that, by 1959, abstract expressionism was at the zenith of its popularity, to such an extent that an unknown artist trying to exhibit in New York couldn't find a gallery unless he was painting in a mode derived from one or another member of the New York school. 63. Critics who suggested that abstract expressionism was abusing its own success and that the monopolistic orgy had gone on long enough could find themselves, said Canaday, in a painful situation. He claimed his own lack of appreciation for the New York school had earned him a death threat. 64, Peggy Guggenheim, returning to the States in 1959 after a 12-year absence, was thunderstruck. The entire art movement had become an enormous business venture. The Museum of Modern Art, described by one critic as the overgeared cartel of modernism, held tenaciously to its executive role in manufacturing a history for abstract expressionism. Ordered and systematic, this history reduced what had once been provocative and strange to an academic formula, a received mannerism, an art official. Thus installed within the canon, the freest form of art now lacked freedom. More and more painters produced more and more paintings, which got bigger and bigger and emptier. It was this very stylistic conformity, prescribed by MoMA and the broader social contract, of which it was a part, that brought abstract expressionism to the verge of kitsch. It was like the emperor's clothes, said Jason Epstein. You parade it down the street and you say, "This is great art," and the people along the parade route will agree with you. Who's going to stand up to Clem Greenberg and later to the Rockefellers who were buying it for their bank lobbies and say, "This stuff is terrible"? 65. Perhaps Dwight MacDonald was right when he said, few Americans care to argue with $100 million. 66. What of the artists themselves? Did they not object to the Cold War rhetoric, what Peter Fuller called the ideological laundering that often accompanied exhibitions of their work? One of the extraordinary features of the role that American painting played in the cultural Cold War is not the fact alone that it became part of this enterprise, but that a movement which so deliberately declared itself to be apolitical could become so intensely politicized. Modern painting is the bulwark of the individual creative expression, aloof from the political left and its blood brother, the right, 67, the artist Paul Berlin had declared. For critic Harold Rosenberg, post-war art entailed the political choice of giving up politics. Yet in its politically shrewd reaction against politics, in its ostensible demonstration that competing ideologies had depleted themselves and dissipated adherents. The new painters and their supporters had of course become fully engaged in the issues of the day. Was their work entirely at odds with the social and political function to which it was put? Barnett Newman, in his introduction to the catalog of the 1943 show, First Exhibition of Modern American Artists, wrote, "We have come together as American modern artists because we feel the need to present to public a body of art that will adequately reflect the new America that is taking place today and the kind of America that will, it is hoped, become the cultural center of the world." 69. Did Newman come to regret this national context? Willem de Kooning found this Americanness to be a certain burden and said, "If you come from a small nation, you don't have that. When I went to the academy and I was drawing from the nude, I was making the drawing, not Holland. I feel sometimes an American artist must feel like a baseball player or something, a member of a team writing American history." 70. Yet in 1963, de Kooning was proud to receive the President's Medal. The idea of an isolated American painting seems absurd to me, just as the idea of creating a purely American mathematics or physics would seem absurd, 71, said Jackson Pollock, who died at the wheel of his Oldsmobile before he faced the choice of whether or not to accept such honors. Robert Motherwell, who was initially happy to be part of the mission to make painting in America equal to painting elsewhere, later thought it strange when a commodity is more powerful than the men who make it. 72. Repudiating nationalist claims for abstract expressionism, in the 1970s, he supported the English abstract artist Patrick Heron when he challenged America's right to exert a monopoly in cultural leadership, and wrote of Heron's gallant efforts in New York. Imperialism. Your generation in England made a heroic effort to reach beyond gentlemanly art, which was not then or now given its just due because of New York's want of generosity toward your generation in Britain. Motherwell added that he looked forward to an unchauvinistic story of modern art, and ended by reassuring Heron that not all Americans are Mongols. 73. Motherwell was a member of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. So were Bazios, Calder, and Pollock, though he was sodden with drink when he joined. The realist painter Ben Shahn refused to join, referring to it as the AC fuck. Former fellow travelers Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb both became committed anti-communists during the Cold War. In 1940, they helped found the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors, which started by condemning all threats to culture from nationalistic and reactionary political movements. In the following months, the Federation became an active agent for anti-communism in the art world. It sought to expose party influence in various art organizations. Rothko and Gottlieb led these efforts to destroy communist presence in the art world. Their dedication to that cause was so strong that when the Federation voted to cease its political activities in 1953, they resigned. Ad Reinhardt was the only abstract expressionist who continued to cleave to the left, and as such, he was all but ignored by the official art world until the 1960s. This left him in a perfect position to point out the inconsistencies in the lives and art of his former friends, whose drunken evenings at the Cedar Tavern had given way to homes in the Hamptons, Providence, and Cape Cod, and whose group photos, like the Irascibles of 1950, had been replaced by features in Vogue magazine showing these angry young men looking more like the stockbrokers who listed them as speculative or growth painters, and reported a market for abstract expressionism boiling with activity. Reinhardt roundly condemned his fellow artists for succumbing to the temptations of greed and ambition. He called Rothko a Vogue magazine cold water flat fauve and Pollock a Harper's Bazaar bum. Barnett Newman was the avant-garde huckster handicraftsman and educational shopkeeper, and the holy roller explainer entertainer in residence, a comment which provoked Newman to sue. Reinhardt didn't stop there. He said that a museum should be a treasure house and tomb, not a counting house or amusement center. 74, he compared art criticism to pigeon droolings and ridiculed Greenberg as a dictator pope. Reinhardt was the only abstract expressionist to participate in the March on Washington for Black Rights in August 1963. It is hard to sustain the argument that the abstract expressionists merely happened to be painting in the Cold War and not for the Cold War. 75, their own statements and, in some cases, political allegiances undermine claims of ideological disengagement. But it is also the case that the work of the abstract expressionists cannot be reduced to the political history in which it is situated. Abstract expressionism, like jazz, is a creative phenomenon existing independently and even, yes, triumphantly, apart from the political use which was made of it. There's no doubt that we need to understand all art in relationship to its time, argued Philip Dodd. In order to make sense of abstract expressionism, we need to understand how it was made during an extraordinary moment in European and American relationships. At a political level, these were a generation of radicals beached by history, and at a national level, they emerged just at the moment when America became the great cultural imperium of the post-war period. All these things need to be understood in order to be able to assess their achievements. But their art cannot be reduced to those conditions. It is true that the CIA were involved. I lament that as much as anybody else laments it, but that doesn't explain why it became important. There was something in the art itself that allowed it to triumph. 76, Jackson Pollock was killed in a car crash in 1956, by which time Arshile Gorky had already hanged himself. Franz Klein was to drink himself to death within 6 years. In 1965, the sculptor David Smith died following a car crash. In 1970, Mark Rothko slashed his veins and bled to death on his studio floor. Some of his friends felt that he killed himself, partly because he could not cope with the contradiction of being showered with material rewards for works which howled their opposition to bourgeois materialism. "The country is proud of its dead poets," says the narrator of Humboldt's Gift. It takes terrific satisfaction in the poet's testimony that the USA is too tough, too big, too much, too rugged, that American reality is overpowering. The weakness of the spiritual powers is proved in the childishness, madness, drunkenness, and despair of these martyrs. So poets are loved, but loved because they just can't make it here. They exist to light up the enormity of the awful tangle.